Welcome to the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also Not That Too. I'm Ryan Rogers, and also a big dumb Jurassic Park fan. Welcome to episode 5, The Beach, recorded during March break, March 18, 2022. Thanks for joining me today. You're listening to Snail's T-shirts, and the outro today is Death of a Dream. Thanks again to Snail and Christoph Oakes for the use of his music. You can find his album on Spotify and Bandcamp. We have some corrections. First, the ending to Watchmen by Alan Moore does, technically, if you really pay attention, make sense. Apologies for saying otherwise. And finally, the Queen is not my mum. Long live the Queen. And I'm going to get my puckering, peeping pee performances away from the microphone so we don't have so many peaked moments in the audio. I'll try my best. I promise. In dinosaur news, we have Sauropod Strides. A study of sauropod tracks shows the dinosaurs had a gait unlike any creature alive today, says an article. Current Biology has published the article, A New Method to Calculate Limb Phase from Trackways Reveals Gait of Sauropod Dinosaurs, early in March. The paper says limb phase, which is the timing of footfalls in quadrupedal locomotion, which describes common gaits such as a trot and a pace, is widely believed to be practically impossible to estimate for extinct tetrapods. The authors say, well, didn't you try doing this? And then they presented a new approach which uses variation patterns in long trackways, which was tested on modern animal trackways where the, quote, the estimates generally correspond well with the actual limb phase, unquote. They applied that approach to the limb phases of giant, wide-gauged sauropods based on 3 long trackways from the lower Cretaceous of Arkansas, USA. They found that a front foot touched down on the ground just before a hind foot on the opposite side was lifted, suggesting the giant creatures didn't wobble as they walked. The footfalls of the diagonal limb pairs are more closely related than those of the limbs on the same side of the body. Thus, the front left foot walked in sequence with the rear right foot or the diagonal pair, and vice versa. Why? This theoretically provides more support throughout the step cycle, reducing the animal's giant girth from swaying from side to side while it walked, which would result in imbalance or simply wasting precious energy. We have Torosaurus taxonomy. The Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society published in early March a paper called The Record of Torosaurus in Canada and its Taxonomic Implications, in which the authors weigh in on whether the Torosaurus is a species of Triceratops or not, which has been a scientific uncertainty. Some have argued that Torosaurus is, quote, simply a skeletally mature growth form of the contemporaneous Triceratops. Their study, however, describes and illustrates the relevant frill material from Canada associated with Torosaurus and determined it is, quote, most plausibly attributable to the Torosaurus morph. And furthermore, their osteohistological sampling shows that this is a not yet mature adult. This finding, in addition to other considerations presented within the paper, lead the authors to conclude that Torosaurus is a valid genus and not simply a mature growth form of a Triceratops. This study is led by author Jordan Mallon, who may be familiar for being the Canadian paleontologist who helped name the ceratopsian Spiclypeus shipporum, which was a chasmosaur of the late Cretaceous, introduced in 2016. Spiclypeus shipporum is Latin for spike shield for Bill and Linda Ship, and that's a pretty good name, eh? What about Mr. Spiclypeus? Do you like that name?
Mr. Spiclypeus. Well, first of all, congratulations on pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I respond to that.
All right. With me for some fun this episode is research scientist and dinosaur paleontologist from the Canadian Museum of Nature, Jordan Mallon. We met after we both swiped right on a double-blind catfishing scheme. And oddly enough, we've hit it off, so we're gonna do a podcast now.
I'll never swipe right again.
So you had news this week that came out about settling the debate on Torosaurus, whether it was a distinct species or not. When you publish something like that, do you doom scroll through the comments afterwards to see how irate some people become over this?
Well, first of all, thank you for seeing that. I'm glad you saw that. Do I doom scroll? Yeah, I admit a little bit I do. I'm on Twitter. I use Twitter specifically for outreach, professional outreach. And so I post my research on Twitter. So it's always fun to read the reaction to that or to Google the the URL for the paper and see how people are,
Right.
uptaking it or whatnot. So yeah, there's a bit of that. In this case, the debate about Torosaurus is whether or not it's just an adult form of Triceratops, which I think that notion is really unpopular, for better or for worse. And so a lot of the sort of dino memes on the internet are on my side. So it's very affirming in that sense, I suppose. But
The recap was that there was some provocation that perhaps a Torosaurus was just a more mature version of a Triceratops, and that therefore the two were likely or arguably the same species. But there was evidence on either side that said, maybe not. And your evidence that said maybe not, or probably
I
not.
think this idea, this debate, as it were, that Torosaurus is a mature growth form of Triceratops is a really cool idea. I think it's a great hypothesis and one that we can test, which is what I attempted to do in this paper of mine that just came out, which argues otherwise, which argues that Torosaurus and Triceratops are two different things based on various lines of evidence, but mostly having to do with their bone histology, looking at the growth marks left in the bone and what that might suggest about whether one is more mature than the other. And there's more work to be done there, and I make that point in the paper. But yeah, the guy who suggested the synonymy of Torosaurus and Triceratops, John Scannell, is a good friend of mine, and he's completely game when it comes to testing these ideas, and he takes no offense in my thinking otherwise. So I respect the hell out of him for that.
So, like, when you do something like this, do you shake hands and go, "Okay, it's settled," or do you hold your breath and wait for the retort?
I'm under no illusions that I've settled the debate. I think there still needs to be more evidence, one way or the other. I don't think I've settled the debate by any means. I think I've just provided one more piece of evidence in favor of the traditional classification of these two things as separate genera. But I have no doubt that there's more research to come. In fact, I know there's more research in the pipelines that'll weigh in on the debate. So.
Okay.
I just threw my hat in. That's all right.
And certainly this is something that's been done on the pachycephalosaurs that have. They said, well, maybe these are juvenile to mature. The specimens show a spectrum of a single species going through different ages versus distinct species at different times. And then the tyrannosaurs as well just had their moment where...
Yes, they did. Trying to split one species into three. Yeah. The pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, right? We distinguish in paleo or taxonomy generally between lumpers and splitters, between those people who would subsume all these various species under one species and maybe recognize subspecies at most, or the other opposite extreme where these people would break up of as many species as there are individuals almost. And this is something that there's a lot of this going on today, as you say, in paleo, Torosaurus and the pachycephalosaurs and T-Rex, but it's been going on forever, really. The early paleontologists, Cope and Marsh, that were finding a lot of the first dinosaurs in the Jurassic Midwest were easily splitters. They named every tooth they found. And then there was a sort of a swing back. I'm thinking, for example, of Peter Dodson's work in the 70s. Peter Dodson, Canadian paleontologist based in the States now, but he had a great paper in the 70s synonymizing a lot of different duck-billed dinosaurs, for example, recognizing that what we were calling different species are just growth forms of one another, or male and female of one another. So the pendulum swung back that way in the 70s with respect to duck-billed dinosaurs, and some folks split them up again. It's a difficult science in that it's hard to know what the right answer is. It's hard to confirm the right answer is.
And you're trying to compare a tooth to a jaw to a leg to a finger, and it's not always apples to apples, is it?
That's the nature of paleontology that makes it difficult and interesting, I guess. That's what keeps us employed as paleontologists, is the incomplete nature of the fossil record. If we had all the fossils, we'd probably have all the answers, and then and then we'd have to move on.
Well, thank you for your comment on that. That's breaking news. Jordan, in his professional profile, people should understand that he has unlocked the greatest achievement that there is. Under specialties, it says dinosaurs. So you've won the game of life. That's pretty cool to me. When you go to school to become a paleontologist, how often does the Jurassic Park book come up on the syllabus?
Good question. Let me think. In my schooling, never.
Yeah.
Never. I think by the time you get to university, you probably read it by then. Or certainly I did. So
Yeah.
it was on the syllabus in grade school.
Was
you know, I think I wrote a book report on it in grade, I don't know, 7 or 8 or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
But, you know, there's often, you know, in a lot of science fiction courses you might do, Jurassic Park inevitably comes up. And so there might be discussion that ensues from there. I did my undergrad at Carleton University. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, they had something called Suds and Slides, where all the earth science majors would get together, drink beers, and watch goofy sci-fi movies.
Okay.
Surrounding, you know, apropos earth science or paleontology or what have you. So Jurassic Park was certainly on the list there, but that wasn't for credit.
No doubt. Does it like in economics classes? I don't think that Gordon Gekko from Wall Street comes up very often, but does when you're going up through the different classes and learning, but does it come up as a reference? I mean, surely it's not on the syllabus. I was being facetious, of course, but do people make mention of it to relate to the curricula?
Yeah, I think people can't help but relate to it just because it's such a, you know, it's so entrenched in popular culture. You know, I think most people's ideas now of what a dinosaur looks like comes from Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. You know, I remember being at the store a couple of years ago and they had dinosaur plushies in the store. They were just no-name brand, one-off dino plushies, but they had a Dilophosaurus there with the big crest on it, right? The big frill that mm-hmm. they made up for Jurassic Park. And this was not a Jurassic Park product at all, but because that's the popular image now, what Dilophosaurus, that's literally what everyone thinks Dilophosaurus looks like now, right? So, when we think dinosaurs, we think Jurassic Park quite often. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no escape from that.
I liked how the movie adapted some known reptilian traits to try and characterize their portrayal of the dinosaur. I thought that was really inventive. But you're right, it has had maybe a more significant impact than they might have imagined.
That's interesting. I gather that the folks who worked on the movie recognized at the time that it would be something special, certainly when they were coming up with the special effects. I don't know if there was as much conversation about the impact that it would have mm-hmm. on paleontology, right?
Right.
You know, Jurassic Park was a big inspiration to me growing up to become a paleontologist, and I know for a fact that that's true of many other folks around my age, you know, who are in the field now. There was just an explosion of interest, which led to an explosion of new paleontologists coming up through the ranks. In fact, more than there's room for in the field. There's not a ton of money in paleo, so there aren't a ton of positions.
It gets competitive, yeah.
Oh, it's competitive. All of academia is competitive, you know, not just paleontology in any sense.
So have you read the book? You mentioned it was a high school book report. Have you read it post dinosaur experts?
I've not read it very recently, I admit, but I read it a ton as a kid. I in fact, because I knew we'd be talking about the book, I brought my copy, and it's all.
I got the same one. Oh,
it's all very dog-eared. Yep.
Yeah.
There you go.
This must have come out in association with the movie, of course, and so we all have the same 93 edition.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
I remember when I bought that. In fact, it was shortly after seeing the movie.
Yeah.
I went with my mom to the drugstore, Shoppers Drug Mart, which is still there, and I bought the book. And then I remember we went to Tim Hortons for donuts or whatever, and I started reading the book in there because I couldn't wait.
Yeah. So what are some of your favorite memories from the text that either stick out or, you know, ring true or maybe ring false or things like that?
Yeah, well, of course, the book's pretty different from the movie.
Yes.
So that's one thing that really struck me reading it. You know, the movie came out in 93. I was 11 when the movie came out, and I would have been 11 when I started reading this book. Right. And I remember I would read it every night before bed, and I remember being struck by how different it was from the movie. I think this was the first time I had ever read a book that had a movie adaptation, other than maybe a Disney Golden Books or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
But that struck me. I think the violence struck me. I remember reading. There's the part in the book where, you know, Dennis Nedry's stealing the embryos and he gets eaten alive by, you know, the Dilophosaurus. And in the book, I think it explains in pretty gruesome detail about his guts spilling out.
Yes. Being disemboweled happens a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and the character, I think it's Ed Regis, gets eaten by a baby tyrannosaur in the book, right?
That's right, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I remember that being pretty gory too. But I remember reading those parts and then having to turn out the lights. And you know, you're 11 years old. You're kind of like, oh, geez, now I got to go to sleep thinking about that.
I think Wu gets his intestines put on the floor. I think Nedry gets kicked. His intestines wind up on the floor. What really got me was at the beginning. There's the bassinet with the baby, and you can see the copies, and they described that you could already see. Just by the color, the red that was all over that.
It was tearing the flesh off the baby's face, right?
And they don't go into particular detail, but just that she didn't have to look to know that the baby hadn't survived. And I thought, wow, there was a lot of. You're right. Some of it was very graphic, and some of it was implied, but it was all very. It had a lot of gravitas to it. That's for sure. It was intimidating to think.
Especially for a kid.
Yeah. And of course, we couldn't wait to watch the movie. We had to get the book right away or read it over and over. Yeah, it's crazy. Because after it didn't come out on cassette for quite a while, and so I'm sure we read the book too many times. Yeah, waiting for that.
I remember
dang cassette. I
remember trying to get the cassette with my dad. The movie came out, and I think the VHS only came out a year and a half later. And I remember my dad would, on Friday nights as a kid, my dad would take my sister and I out to the mall, and we'd go to the arcade, blow $2 there on video games or whatever. But I remember around that time, every Friday night we'd go to the video store at the mall and ask, like, is Jurassic Park out yet? He said, no, not yet. No, not yet. No, not yet. Ask us next time.
Nothing takes that long now, yeah.
Did that for a while. Yeah, it took forever, but you know, that was kind of special. The delayed gratification. It's like anything now, right? It was like waiting for Christmas back then.
I wonder if
now my kids just watch Netflix and they can binge the whole thing at once.
That's the longest anybody had to wait to watch it. I think is that time between the movie and then the cassette. Otherwise, since then we've all been able to watch it whenever we want.
Absolutely, yeah. It was like waiting for Christmas. That's the best comparison.
For sure. And so when I read the book, I'm looking for, especially as I'm trying to do like this deep dive on it, for new ideas and inspirations and topics to consider, so I can, ask it questions and have it ask me questions, and then think about it and try and research what it all means in the end. To you, was there anything you wonder about the book, or a question, or something that was confusing that you'd be interested to know more about?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Anything I'd be curious to know more about. I guess what I'd be most curious about now is just behind the inspiration of some of those ideas, some of the people. I did do some prep before this and listen to your last episode of your podcast. And,
oh wow, okay.
And you talk there. I think you read the opening chapter there, talking about how some of the technology companies that are referenced there are actually not, they exist in reality, which I wasn't aware of. And you drew some comparisons there between Hammond and Wu and real life personalities in the tech business today, which I wasn't aware of. I think that's really interesting. And I think I'd be interested in pursuing that a little more. Those would be the questions that kind of come up for me.
They make a few touchstones. One, I think Muldoon is they reference a particular, I can't think of the real life safari zoo designer, but Muldoon was based off of a character. And do you remember I think it was called the Terratops Lodge, the restaurant they didn't open in the aviary?
Yes, I do remember that. Yep.
And it's spelled different than the spelling I can find. But the school that the chef that was going to make the Chilean sea bass is schooled at the same place that Wolfgang Puck was famously educated
Oh,
at.
no kidding.
And so
See,
I
that's
want,
cool. That's
yeah.
cool to me to make those connections. Yeah, yeah.
So certainly there's Crichton had his touchstones that he was incorporating. And so when he doesn't do a lot, we were saying a lot of that, he doesn't use a lot of flowery language, but when he does make an illusion, it has a real life analog that means something, and he's borrowed something of that real life thing to make sense of what he's putting into the park. So I try and find there's one thing that I'm going to get into eventually is Nedry's password was Mr. Goodbites, and
Yes, yeah.
I've got an X-rated 10-page long discussion on what that possibly means, but because I can only guess, but I got a pretty good argument for it, I think.
Mr. Goodbites. I wouldn't have the slightest clue. And of course, there was the White Rabbit thing too. White Rabbit object that made its way into the movie. That I don't remember that reference. I remember that's a reference to what Alice in Wonderland. But
And there's a couple.
what's that all about, right?
Yeah, I know that at the end they go through that tunnel to get into the raptor nest, and there's following the rabbit hole that kind of pops them through. The other thing, the White Rabbit is kind of like one of those things that pull you through the story. You follow the rabbit, and then you embark upon adventure. And I think I don't know if there's a way to put it, but like the compy, those little lizard bites at the beginning of the book, they kind of are the thing that leads us to the park. And the story ends up getting dropped, but I wonder if the compy could be seen as the White Rabbit that kind of travel. It follows the narrative. The science follows. What is this thing? The questions all lead up to Grant, and then Grant gets taken to the island to further, I guess, explore what this lizard might be. And I don't know. I don't know if there's
Now
a
I have to
convincing
read the
argument
book
or not.
again with that.
Most of this stuff, it asks for you to go back and look later, and maybe you can find something new out of it when you read it again. But it doesn't, in and of itself, at that moment as you read it, necessarily mean a whole lot. So it makes you wonder. But I guess in terms of doing a deep dive, it's worth to go back and look and see what you can find. So that's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those books I think, although it's been a few years now since I've read it. As I say, I've read it probably, I don't know how many times, 10 times or whatever growing up. And it's one of those it's one of those books where you go back and read it, or you listen to it on audio book or something like that.
Yes.
And every time you read it, you notice something
new,
new or something different, which is the sign of a good story when you can go back to it with fresh eyes and see something new in it.
I used to, so at the same era, I picked up like as many Far Side anthologies as I could, and still today, picking up an old book of the Far Side comics, there's new jokes. You go, oh, I never got that before, and even them. So most of them you still don't get, but there's every once in a while you go, oh, I wonder what that was about.
I've got kids of my own now who are growing up watching a lot of the same movies that I did as a kid, and it's always you always get a bit of pleasure out of it when you get the references that you didn't get as a kid in the movies. This was written for adults too. I didn't appreciate that as a kid.
Well, certainly written by adults, and they sometimes can't help themselves, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Well, I have a dinosaur professional, a specialist. I have a case to be made. Do you remember Dr. Harding, the veterinarian?
I do, yeah.
He's a lasting character in the book. He kind of gets introduced midway, but he survives to the end. He has heroic moments. He gets to help Sattler, I think, escape velociraptors on the roof of the visitor center. He also is the one that's...
Did he do that? Yeah, I don't remember that. I remember she jumped into a pool.
Yes.
I don't remember him helping her do that.
I think he meant to help her, but he had things backwards, and she ended up getting trapped or locked out or something. But he intended to. He had good intentions. He's the one administering medications to Ian Malcolm, and he has no first name. But I have a case to make that he may not be a very good veterinarian. And so, case one, the stegosaurs are getting poisoned, and there is the toxic West Indian lilac plants that are in the habitat. I would think, before you diagnosed anything, there's these toxic plants and you have a poisoned animal, step one would be, before you dig through any dung, to just remove the plants. Straight off the island, because you've got a bunch of dumb herbivores that you just don't need toxic plants for them to even try to eat. So that was step one. Two, he does dig through the dung and ignores the traces of the toxic West Indian lilac berries, which were, I guess, confirmed to be causing the illness, because he was only looking for the toxic West Indian lilac shrubbery. So, point two. Three, he has no record of what quantity of tranquilizer to use to dose the tyrannosaur, which seems like that should be something you would have figured out, at least along the way.
I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that one, given that dinosaurs in the story are relatively new. So
Yes.
I don't know. Did he write the book on veterinary treatment of dinosaurs yet? I don't know.
He certainly intended to. That's right. That's one of the points. But I think most indicting is there are multiple species all over the island that are breeding. They're mating, they're nesting, they're raising young that are undocumented, and he never noticed. And he doesn't believe it when they find the eggshell. He goes, "That can't be a dinosaur egg." He literally, convincingly, wholeheartedly does not believe that they could be breeding. So that raises a couple questions. Maybe this guy is not a great veterinarian. So maybe we could role play a little bit, and you can tell me what, as a specialist, you think. Say a male, perhaps a velociraptor, spontaneously one day changes gender in the wild per the frog DNA explanation, and this dude finds himself in a harem of ladies. He's suddenly the last man on Earth, so to speak. What signs that there's a male amongst the females might a veterinarian who's observing these animals, if not in the wild, at least on monitors, begin to notice, in your opinion?
What are the signs that he would look for that would suggest that there's a male in the wild? Oh boy, that's a good question. Well, I'll start by adding one more. It always struck me watching the movie too, because he's in the movie. And,
Yep.
you know, he's trying to figure out why it's the Triceratops that's sick in the movie, and he can't figure it out. And in comes a paleobotanist who figures out. Well, I don't know in the movie if we actually really. I don't think that plot is finished. What
Yes.
sort of happens, but presumably it's the paleobotanist who comes in, and saves the day, and figures out the issue. And you're left wondering, like, how bad must this veterinarian be?
Yeah.
That he can't even do his own job. That someone who isn't even trained in his field, who works on fossil plants,
Yeah.
can come and solve this riddle. I thought that was kind of goofy.
That was unfortunate, yes.
It speaks to your point, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, getting back to your question, what sort of
behaviorally.
signs might
Yeah.
behaviorally? Oh boy. Well, of course, that presumes we know how velociraptors behave, which we really don't know.
We don't
but
know.
display behavior, you know, if we're looking at the animals, if we're able to witness them, signs of display behaviors would certainly, I mean, very often we look at male or female birds, very often the males and females look differently. So presumably if there was a male introduced in the population, it might look a little bit different from the female. Who knows with frog DNA, that kind of burns up the whole story. But, you know, dinosaurs, certainly Velociraptor, we know had feathers. In fact, it had probably display feathers coming off of its arms. We haven't found the feathers themselves, but we certainly found the quill knobs that suggest that they had these types of feathers that may have been used for something like sexual display. So, sexual display, form of dancing or something like that. It might be something we might look for. Yeah, that strikes me as fairly obvious. Maybe they had special scent glands we don't know about.
Okay.
Who knows if humans would be able to pick up on that, but maybe, you know, the vet might notice there's a new musk in the air that I don't recognize, and that might turn off a trigger as well.
With birds, we see the males doing all kinds of extraordinary things, with feathers, but also dancing. That famous episode of the Dinosaurs by Jim Henson's group, where it was just all about the mating dance, the world's youngest profession, they called it. I think there would be something behavioral that would suggest that there's a male that's looking at.
Yeah, and you suggested one earlier too, just nesting behaviors, right? What the hell are they doing creating nests for and laying eggs if there's no males on the island to breed with? You know, even if you don't have the eggs, if you see the dinosaurs building a nest, often nesting behavior is triggered by the act of being gravid, of carrying eggs. So you see your dinosaurs start nest building. In this case, I think the velociraptors built their nest on the beach or something like that, underground. That might lead you to wonder what's going on there.
Yeah, they're supposed to be underground and nocturnal. The reason they couldn't observe all of this behavior is that they're nocturnal. But that seems a little that means it's fairly species specific when we know that there are other species on the island that are also reproducing. And yeah, it falls a little short. Like they're supposed to be on monitors, I guess.
Yeah, those monitors didn't work very well.
No.
That's one thing that always struck me in the book too. That's another sort of plot line of the book. I remember Grant having to get the kids back to the lodge there by following all the
motion sensors.
The motion sensors that were numbered. I think he counted them down going east or whatever direction he was going in.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember that distinctly from the book, and that's one thing that never made its way into the book were those motion sensors.
Tracking the animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple matters that I guess Malcolm would say, oh yeah, well it's expected that you guys are idiots, so that's why chaos theory is proven right again. Yeah, and the females, I think if you had two males all of a sudden and you had a variety of impregnated females or nesting females or even juveniles, you'd think that with multiple males there could be different behaviors that would perhaps manifest themselves in terms of
well, then of course you got potentially mating competitioning happening.
Yeah.
Right? If you've got more than one male, there'd be plenty of females around. There wouldn't be much of competition, but I suppose if you had a certain threshold of males, you might see competition between the males for those females, which can, we certainly think there was some research that came out recently by a good friend of mine, Caleb Brown, at the Tyrrell Museum that showed that tyrannosaurs were biting one another's faces on a regular basis, and we don't know why they did that, but competition for mates would potentially be a good explanation for that.
Yeah.
So dinosaurs certainly did that, and if you saw it in a wild population of dinosaurs that you thought were otherwise all female, you go, what are they competing for?
I'll see lots of pictures of, and not that jungle cats are analogs to dinosaurs by any stretch. I don't know that they're analogs for anything, but jungle cats, you'll see tigers and cheetahs and stuff like that are beautiful looking animals, but lions are commonly thrashed across the face. They have these scars and deep wounds and just, man, I don't think there's a single good thing about being a lion. They find a lot of trouble everywhere they go.
The only ones they have to worry about are themselves, more or less. I guess that's the good thing about being a lion, but even then you've still got to worry. And it was very much the case with dinosaurs too, again, getting back to those tyrannosaurs who were constantly biting one another's faces. That couldn't have been pleasant.
No, I bet they're digging at the same carcass or something, and
could be they were fighting over resources, fighting for mates, fighting for territory. Who the heck knows?
Well, I guess they certainly weren't going to be swinging their arms at each other. I mean, they had kind of the one superlative weapon to stop things, and that was their huge head. So
it's all in the teeth, and crocs do the same. You'll often see pictures of crocs with half their face bitten off, and somehow they still manage to eke out a living. But they bite one another's faces too. Actually, that's part of Caleb's work. He was able to show this very same traces in modern alligator skulls. So there's a nice comparison there, a nice analog.
So talking about other papers and alligators or crocodiles, you had one as well that's kind of on this subject, and I'll see if I can pronounce all these things correctly, but it's the ontogeny of a sexually selected structure in an extant archosaur with implications for sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs. That wasn't so long ago that you would be non-conversational about it, is it?
Oh boy. I have a really short memory, but I do remember publishing that paper.
Well, I'm going to probably ask you some hypothetical stuff anyhow that doesn't really relate to that specifically, but you, to recap, and Dr. David Hone, it says, Patrick Hennessy, and Lawrence M. Whitner collaborated to, Malcolm would say, lift the skirts on some modern-day garials that are sexually dimorphic in size. Is it the males are bigger?
In garials, yes, the males are quite a bit bigger. And they have this big gara on the snout. Yeah.
Right. So it looks like they tried to sniff like that new tennis ball smell out of the can, and then one of the balls got stuck on their snout. And they've got this.
It's like that scene out of Total Recall when Schwarzenegger pulls that giant tracking device out of his nose. It's like it got stuck,
Okay. In any case, so we've got this. The ladies must like that because it's become what all the males need to have to make sure that they can propagate the species. So, what might you have learned from that study that applies to dinosaur sexual dimorphism?
Mm. Well, I guess I'll preface it by just saying that this is a topic that I've been tangentially interested in over the years, identifying sexual dimorphism of dinosaurs. And what all sexual dimorphism is differences, physical differences between males and females. At least those are the differences that we look for in the fossil record. I did my undergraduate work on a purportedly sexually dimorphic species of chasmosaur, which is a horned dinosaur. So I think that's probably what got me interested in that. And Dave has written about dimorphism and sexual selection in the fossil record before too. So we kind of got our heads together on this. Dave invited me in on this project because he had this great record, this great data set of measurements from these garials, and he wanted help running the statistics on it. You know, I've published a paper before that argued that despite claims to the contrary, it's really hard to statistically support sexual dimorphism in the fossil record. There's just so many unknowns that we need to control for in order to show that signal there, to show that there's two peaks, so to speak,
Right.
be it in body size or in the shape of some purportedly dimorphic cranial crest or something like that. Primarily, you need to be able to control for age, you know.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't know if you're comparing a young, large male to an old, smallish female. They're going to end up looking the same, and you're not going to be able to tease that signal out. And so this is other work that Dave and I have done too, a paper showing that. Where the garials come into it was, this is an example of a really distinctly dimorphic species where the males are very obviously different from the females. And part of what we were trying to show was that even knowing that beforehand, if you don't discriminate for size or discriminate for age, it can be hard to distinguish those things unless you've got lots, and unless you've got a feature like the gara, which is on the snout, that it's either on or off, right? It's there or it's not. And there aren't many examples of these sort of bimodal or bivariate structures, if you want to call it that, or binary structures is the word I'm looking for, in the fossil record, right? We don't have good examples of dimorphism on that order in any known species of dinosaur. Usually it's a continuous structure that might be better expressed in some individuals than others, but they've all got it, right? And when you're sort of starting to blur the lines that way in the fossil record, it can get really hard to say, well, these ones are the girls and these ones are the boys.
Yeah. And certainly it would be difficult. I mean, you'd be hoping, the only way it would work out in paleontology, you're hoping that it's going to be something that's remnant in a fossil, as opposed to if it were, you know, skin or color or plumage. Like it's got to fossilize, or else you won't be able to find the distinctions. It's hard.
Yeah, and there's ways of getting about that, of getting around that issue in the fossil record.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's a special type of bone that we find in birds today called medullary bone, which is found in gravid egg-laying females, and it's a special spongy type of bone that lines the inside of the bone, and it's basically a source of calcium for shelling those eggs. And so you know when you see that special medullary type of bone that you've got a pregnant, as it were, or a gravid female.
That's interesting.
We see that same bone in some specimens of dinosaurs, and we can definitively say, therefore, that these are females. The trick then is being able to correlate that bone with certain structures of the rest of the skeleton to be able to say, well, all the females look like this and all the males look like that. And of course, that's not a that's not a smoking gun piece of evidence either for being able to discriminate males from females, only because it might be, if you don't see that special type of medullary bone, it might just be that you have a female that's not laying eggs,
Right, right.
So there's a distinction there that you have to be very careful about. So
Is the medullary bone
it's tricky.
were you finding that in primarily theropods, or when you were doing your ceratopsian work, did you find it there, or
Well,
who's
I've
showing
not
us
found
this?
it myself, but it's been reported in T-Rex.
Yeah.
I believe it's been reported in Brachylophosaurus too, a duck-billed dinosaur. It's been found in across various lineages, I should say, of dinosaurs. So we know that it was fairly widespread, not just in theropods.
All right, very good. Okay, well, yeah, awesome. You studied.
It is awesome, Ryan. It is awesome. I'm just going to interject there. It's amazing what we can say about dinosaurs now.
Yeah.
That's something that we never thought we would know about it, and yet here we stand. We can start to say these are the boys and these are the girls, based on this special bone type, not having to do with the other
Right.
build of the skeleton. We're getting at questions about, what color are dinosaurs now?
Yeah.
What color were their eggs? And, this is all stuff that reading books, you and I growing up reading books, they would have said, we'll never know about that. That information doesn't preserve. And yet, several breakthroughs later, we're having these conversations, which is really cool when you stop to think about it.
Yes. So maybe the next question could be a little bit more of an imagination exercise, but having studied the subject of sexual dimorphism, considered it and thought long and hard about it, perhaps we can review some of the breeding species that were in the book, and you could hypothesize perhaps how they might have differed, other ways that Dr. Harding could have been, a little bit more attentive.
Oh boy! All right,
So
I'm just going to be winging it here.
Yeah, it's imaginative. I don't expect any. You shouldn't be held accountable for your answers. Is what I'm saying. But,
there's nothing to hold me accountable to, so it wouldn't matter. Yeah.
The Maiasaura are breeding. They're mating. Is there any thoughts on how maybe a hadrosaur or an iguanodonid might have appeared different sexually that you can imagine?
Well, hadrosaurs, of course, many of the hadrosaurs have those big crests, especially what we call the lambeosaurine hadrosaurids, which have big crests on their head, things like Hypacrosaurus and Lambeosaurus and Corythosaurus. They've got these big sort of Corinthian crests on their head. Maiasaura had a small crest. It was a crest nonetheless. As far as we know, the males didn't differ from the females in the shapes of those crests. They may have, we just can't pinpoint it yet. Maybe the males had slightly bigger crests than females, but I certainly imagine that they would have had different colors on those crests. So, something like a Maiasaura, which has a very small, thin crest on the top of its head, behind the eyes, above the eyes, might well be that the males had a different colored crest, or a different coloring altogether across the body. It could be. Yep. So that's something I would look for. Different call. We know these hadrosaurs likely, and again, the Lambeosaurians in particular, their crests were hollow. The nasal passages made their way through the crest, and they would have been able to pass air through them. A colleague of mine, Dave Weishample, showed back in the 70s, I guess it was, that they would have made for great resonating chambers. So it may well be that the males had different calls than the females. And so that might have been a way of distinguishing them too by their calls.
Yeah, some crazy honking or humming or something like that would be so bizarre.
Would have, something like it would have been very trombone sounding, lots of low end, maybe like a tuba or something like that.
And the Corythosaurus could have been a French horn.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, Dave Weishample back in the day, and I remember seeing this on documentaries when I was a kid, actually reconstructed with PVC piping the crest of a Parasaurolophus, one of these, looks like it literally has a big trombone sticking out the back of its head. He would blow through it and create all these low sounding notes, and I thought that was pretty cool as a kid. And in fact, we've got an exhibit at the Museum of Nature here in Ottawa that can replicate the sound of a Parasaurolophus as well.
That'd be so crazy to hear them just yelling at each other from however far apart you needed to be.
It would have been loud standing next to them. And in fact, I think, as I remember, Michael Crichton in his book talks about, I think the kids get caught up in a stampede of
That's right.
hadrosaurs at one point.
The
Maybe that
hadrosaurs.
was in the second one. I don't
No,
quite
it's
remember
a
anymore.
hadrosaurs and a stampede, but they made it a gallimimus.
It was hadrosaurus, I think, right, in the book, and yeah, they were really, really loud.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that he got that right.
Another species that was breeding was the Procompsognathus, and those were escaping the island. Any thoughts on how those types of animals might have been different?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a bit trickier because, of course, compsognathus don't have as much going for them of great interest that we might really, speaking like someone who doesn't really work on theropods, right? But they don't have any interesting crests or anything like that on the head. Certainly nothing visually spectacular like a hadrosaur. Mm-hmm. In that case, if they were dimorphic, it might have been more subtle. It might have been subtle differences in coloration. Mm-hmm. And there may well have been size differences too, not just in compies alone, but in many dinosaurs. Although again, it's hard to pick out with the fossil record with the samples that we have. But look at alligators today. The males are almost twice as big as the females, twice as long, nearly. Certainly, a really, really big male can be twice as long as a female. And so there might have been that type of variation there too, where the males were larger than the females in something like a compsognathid, or vice versa, maybe. Mm-hmm. That'd be something else to look for.
So they've got the little ornithischian othnielia were breeding on the park as well. They'd be kind of like these bipedal little things. They would have had beaks and teeth, and have they been the ones I've found with like the feathers all down the back as well?
Well, not Othnielia per se, but relatives of Othnielia we found with feather-like structures, definitely. Yeah. Some of those small bipedal plant-eating dinosaurs, things like Heterodontosaurus, of course, have almost fang-like tusks at the front of the mouth, which are unusual among dinosaurs.
Right.
And it's been suggested that those tusks might have been sexually dimorphic.
Cool.
Which could have been the case. I would argue that it's a hard case to support from the fossil record. I think the evidence just isn't there, but that's the case among some living species, and so it may well have been the case in dinosaurs too, that certain sexes had tusks. One of the sexes had tusks and the other didn't, or something like that.
We can think of like deer now have different, I guess it's horns on their head, but
antlers is another great example where males have them and females don't. More often than not, there's some exceptions to that where both have antlers, but there's not a direct parallel in dinosaurs, as I mentioned, where males have male Triceratops horns and females don't. Every Triceratops we found, they have horns, but there may well have been differences in the length of the horns, or in the shapes of the horns, or in the coloration of the frill, or something like that.
That'd be neat,
there may well have been parallels there. Yeah.
Really cool. And the other breeding beyond Velociraptor was Hypsilophodonts, but I think when you start talking about Heterodontosaurs, that seems to be kind of in the same line.
They're not too distantly related. Yeah. Again, they don't have much interesting Hypsilophodonts, if you ask me, but if you had to design the most generic, boring dinosaur possible, that would be them. And I say that with a smile on my face because I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying that from some of my colleagues, but bring it on.
Well, if only they hear this then. How about that?
Yeah. They again, don't have any interesting crests going on in the head, generally speaking. They were smallish. Males may have differed from females as far as body size goes. One might have been a little larger than the other, or they might have had different colorations or scents or behaviors. But I think they might have been harder to pick out than something like a big hadrosaur. I don't know. I'm just speaking off the cuff here.
Well, you've been so forthcoming with your time. I really, really appreciate it. You mentioned you saw Jurassic Park when you were 11.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a milestone birthday coming up?
Oh, you know about that? I do, yeah.
The math.
Oh, yeah, the math. Yeah, well, that's why I became a paleontologist, so I didn't have to do math. Turns out I was wrong about that. But...
Yeah.
Yes, I'm turning 40. I'm turning 40 next month.
Oh yeah, well, whatever the opposite of happy belated is, to you. That's very good.
Pre-happy birthday.
Unbirthday.
I appreciate that.
Unbirthday.
Yeah,
We go back to Alice in Wonderland. Happy unbirthday.
yeah. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, it's the big 4-0 for me this year.
Well, you, like I said, you've been so forthcoming. I really appreciate you coming on. I would have loved to ask about the computer assisted sonic tomography. I would have loved to have asked about the use of computers in paleontology. I would have loved to have asked about Crichton's portrayal of the Tyrannosaurus. That I think you really, really like that cover design. I think is related to one of the first manuscripts ever written on the Tyrannosaurus, based on the AMNH 5027. And I think that very erect posture is the only way that the Tyrannosaur could be touching the fence. And I would love to, anyhow. So many things
Yeah.
if there were infinite time.
I'll be happy to chat again. And
Yeah?
so if we want to talk about those on a subsequent episode, let's do it. I'm happy to geek out with you.
I couldn't be happier. Well, thank you so much. Again, happy unbirthday. Thanks to my special guest, Dinosaur Specialist, because that's just the best title there is, Jordan Mallon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a thrill it was to chat with a dinosaur paleontologist about dinosaurs, about his own publications, and Jurassic Park at the same time. That's pretty cool. Let's get to the text. This week's chapter is The Beach, pages 20 to 22, a short one. And in a synopsis here, Gutierrez is puzzled by the mystery of the strangely described biting basilisk lizard and is interested in observing the specimen himself, so he visits Cabo Blanco. We have a couple different characters. Marty Gutierrez returns. He's intrigued with this lizard and researches it thoroughly, believing it's important to positively identify this animal for the safety of everyone in the area. He believes there's a new species of lizard out there. There's a medical officer from Amaloya. The medical officer reports that there have been a series of lizard bites. The lizard. Its bite leads to inflammation and is potentially lethal to infants. It's green with brown stripes. It bites. It's believed to be a previously unknown species based on the distinctive pattern of lizard bites over the past 2 months. And we have Dr. Edward H. Simpson. He's an acknowledged expert and emeritus professor of zoology at Columbia University in New York, who is the best person to have this lizard identified. An elegant older man with swept-back white hair, Simpson is the world's leading authority on lizard taxonomy. There are a couple different localities. We have Costa Rica. Only 75 miles wide at its narrowest point, the country is smaller than the state of Maine. In that limited space, Costa Rica has a remarkable diversity of biological habitats. Seacoasts on both of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, 4 separate mountain ranges, including 12,000-foot peaks and active volcanoes, rainforest, cloud forest, temperate zones, swampy marshes, and arid deserts. Such ecological diversity sustained an astonishing diversity of plant and animal life. It's 3 times as many species of birds as all of North America, more than 1,000 species of orchids, more than 5,000 species of insects. New species were being discovered all the time at a pace that has increased in recent years for a sad reason. We have Cabo Blanco, the beach from earlier. What's new about Cabo Blanco? Not much, other than it has been 2 days since the Bowmans had visited the site, where Gutierrez now visits. Carrera Station, where Gutierrez has his office. There's a small research laboratory there. A real national park in Costa Rica that is in fact across the bay, as it was described. In this case, it's the Gulf of Nicoya. Amaloya, a medical officer here, confirms that a 9-day-old infant sleeping in its crib had been bitten on the foot by an animal that was claimed to be a lizard. This is a fictional locality in Costa Rica. Vasquez is the, quote, next village up the coast from either Amaloya or Carrera. It's not quite made clear. It's another fictional village, and a child here is bitten by a lizard while it is sleeping, while he or she is sleeping. Puerta Sotrero. A child is bitten by a lizard here too, and yes, this is also a fictional village. And Columbia University, not fictional, in New York, where Dr. Simpson is emeritus professor and where the sample of the lizard will be sent. Under literary techniques, we have another metaphor where, what do we got here? Quote, watch the afternoon sun fall lower in the sky. Its rays reached beneath the palm trees on page 20. Crichton is having the sun's rays falling and reaching, perhaps making the environment feel more alive. More motifs that continue to emerge throughout the text here. We're continuing the idea of following how Crichton is building a mystery. While lizard bites are common, basilisk lizard bites, which Gutierrez identified the lizard to be, are not. Hospitalization as a result is unheard of. His research library has no reports of basilisk lizard bites, nor of hospitalization due to lizard bites, nor any record in the International Biosciences Services database. And new reports of more lizard bites are emerging on page 21. He says, a child in Vasquez, another in Puerto Sortrero, all occurring in the past 2 months, all involving sleeping children or infants. Gutierrez suspects the presence of a previously unknown species of lizard. He finally finds evidence of the lizard, but it's half-eaten and only partially available thanks to predation from a howler monkey. He can't solve this mystery yet. In the discussion, I think there'd be an interesting case to be made for what has become Jurassic Park's MacGuffin. MacGuffin is a common trope in cinema where an object, event, or character serves to set and keep the plot in motion, despite usually lacking intrinsic importance. Furthermore, in fiction, a MacGuffin is necessary to the plot and the motivation for characters, but in and of itself is insignificant, unimportant, or irrelevant, and is usually revealed in the first act, but thereafter declines in importance. We spent a few chapters now meeting our MacGuffin in Jurassic Park. It is this mysterious, aggressive, brown-striped lizard. This little terror is nipping and gnawing its way through the beginning of the novel, drawing Marty Gutierrez to start asking serious questions about what this new little critter is and wondering if it's dangerous. Spoiler alert to anyone who hasn't read ahead, but these little lizards are going to drive the mystery for a few chapters more and then be almost an afterthought for about 350 pages, returning only for a brief moment that will bookend this novel in a powerful and truly artistic fashion beyond what we've come to expect from Crichton. Hint, it's at the bottom of page 392 if you want to jump ahead. I can't wait to cover that moment because, as I've said, it's poetic and it's kind of like offering a kicker after 391 pages of setup. We can discuss this again when we get there, but the lizard remains and reports of the lizard bites are what probe Bob Morris from the EPA to begin an investigation. The reports of bites reported caused the investors to be nervous, according to Cowan, Swain, and Ross. It's a sample that intrigues Grant at his dig site in Montana. This is the MacGuffin, whereas the rest of the novel isn't about the compies and doesn't address how they got off the island either. When Grant needs to go out and account for all the species that may or may not have gotten off the island, he doesn't care to go find and count the compies' nests. Just the raptors, although he definitely knows that compies have escaped the island, though he is worried that raptors could be getting off too. The compy remains. This mystery sets up the inciting incident which leads to the park inspection and drives their motivations to find the nests, with the purposes of estimating if animals have escaped the island. Further connecting our hero's journey to the MacGuffin, as they're flying off to Isla Nublar, the pilot points out Cabo Blanco on page 77, the locality where the compy, the biting, and the mystery began. This is in part of the end of the first act of the novel, just as we're introduced to Jurassic Park, more formally on page 79 in the chapter Welcome. Does the compy mystery peter out once the plot is in full motion, as per the definition of a MacGuffin? It sure does. On page 88, the last we hear of the compy's remains, Gennaro has requested that the sample in New York be flown to Isla Nublar for it to be examined by Grant. But I believe that's the last we'll hear of those remains. But it served its purpose. At this point, we're at Jurassic Park, and the mystery hardly matters any longer. Furthermore, we have ecological criticism. As my guest Lindsay Longpre suggested in episode 1, Introduction, the InGen Incident, viewing this novel through an ecological lens, considering what messages are being said, whether intentionally or not, about humanity's impact on the environment, bears some fruit early in this novel. As earlier discussed in a description of the locality of Costa Rica, we're told that new species are being discovered all the time at a pace that had increased in recent years for a sad reason. Costa Rica was becoming deforested, and as jungle species lost their habitats, they moved to other areas and sometimes changed behavior as well. So a new species was perfectly possible, believes Marty Gutierrez, but along with the excitement of a new species was the worrisome possibility of new disease. Lizards carried viral disease, including several that could be transmitted to man. The most serious was central saurian encephalitis, or CSE, which caused a form of sleeping sickness in human beings and horses. Here, Crichton aptly describes an ecologically significant biomass that's in critical condition as deforestation is shrinking the unique and severely limited habitat. So that's an important clue as we continue to gather more information that we can use to perform an ecological criticism of the text. And due diligence. This is like Terminator 2 when we used to argue whether there would be a Terminator 3, like if there was still enough of a Terminator's remains in the current timeline for Cyberdyne Systems to create Skynet and evoke Judgment Day. Well, it's kind of like the same with the evidence of the lizard that we have in the book here. The shell game of where the saliva samples and now the actual dinosaur remains continues. The red-tagged saliva sample to be shipped to San Jose, that's still out there somewhere, supposedly in San Jose, and should still be there. And now there's these lizards' remains that are to be sent to New York on page 22, it says. I don't know that we're ever going to hear about that saliva sample ever again. So what a bunch of interesting things that there's 2 little pages managed to cram into them. Just carrying that story a little bit further forward as we follow the bouncing ball that is the MacGuffin through the early moments of this first act. Thanks to my guest today, research scientist and dinosaur paleontologist from the Canadian Museum of Nature, Mr. Spiclypeus himself, Dr. Jordan Mallon. I really hope he comes back. As I sign off today, let me say thank you again for joining me. If you want to read along in the book, add some thoughts to what we've been discussing on the show, or be a guest on the show and chat with me about anything that you like about Jurassic Park, you can do that by connecting with me. I'm at ryansrogers@gmail.com. If you'd like to be a guest, drop me a line and we can try and set something up. We can rehash, tear down, gush over, and chit-chat about any part of the book, or also not the book, all you'd like. Jurassic Park-Cast is part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. You can find links to all that baggage in the show notes, or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com, or finding us on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, or me on Twitter at RogersRyan22. Thank you dearly for tuning into the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where we talk about the novel Jurassic Park, and also not that too. Until next time.